Mabuhay Lagim fam. Before I start this week's episode, I would like to again shamelessly plug my other podcast called Asia in the Shadows, a true crime podcast. Here is a snippet from my latest episode on that podcast. Mona instructed Mazlan to lie down on the floor and to close his eyes. He was told to keep his eyes closed and to wait for money to fall from the sky. Unfortunately for Mazlan, the money never actually fell. Instead, Juraimi approached the unexpecting close-eyed Mazlan and wielded an axe onto his neck so forcefully that Mazlan's head was chopped off. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at AITSPod to know everything about Asia in the Shadows and for some extra true crime content. Also, follow us on Spotify. I will make sure to link our main Spotify page in the show notes. And now on to Lagim's current episode. Hello, Lagim fam. Welcome to a slightly different format of an episode this week. I am calling this a Lagim Podcast Express episode in which I will be covering a rather smaller case or shorter topic just because I need to invest more time in upcoming episodes, and in this case, the anniversary episode, which I will be releasing on the 4th of December, which is, by the way, a Saturday and not a Friday. Today, I circle back to a question that I've been asked a few times already ever since I've started this podcast. Are there any Filipino serial killers? And a follow-up question to that is usually, why aren't there a lot of them anyway? These questions served as a catalyst for a podcast episode with our friends over at the Banana Q podcast. I will make sure to include a link to that episode in which host D and I talked about the reasons, both serious and funny, as to why there are not a lot of serial killers in the Philippines. In this Express episode, however, I want to explore the story of two individuals. One is widely recognized as the first Filipino serial killer, at least in recorded colonial Philippine history and onwards, and the other is the last known serial killer in the country, a reputation that propelled him to urban legend status. Please note that this episode contains details that might be unsettling and disturbing for some individuals, so please take care of yourself whilst listening. This is the story of Padre Juan Severino Maliari and Mualito Waway Toledo. Our first story this week takes us all the way back to the Philippines of the early 1800s. The Philippines, or Las Islas Filipinas, named after King Philip II of Spain, had been under Spanish colonial rule for close to 300 years at this point and was ruled through a viceroyalty in New Spain, also known as Mexico. Even though it would not be for another 80 years or so that Spain would give up our country to the Americans for the price of $20 million, Filipino nationalism was on the rise, and even in the Catholic Church, more Filipinos were answering to the call of priesthood. The clergy was not reserved for those from Spain or from mixed Spanish and Filipino heritage anymore, and one Filipino who was called into becoming a servant of God was a young man from Macabebe, Pampanga, named Juan Severino Maliari. Not much is known about his date of birth or place, but it is presumed that he was a native of Macabebe, which was just south of Magalang, Pampanga. Macabebe has a long and proud history. People of Macabebe, or Macabebes, were the first Kapampangans who appeared in European recorded history. During Spain's rule over the Philippines, Macabebe was considered as one of the oldest and most important communities in Pampanga because, amongst many other things, of its proximity to the Pampanga River. This river allowed trade and the further settlement of other Kapampangan towns in the area, therefore expanding the region we now know as Pampanga. And it was in this historical Macabebe that Juan Severino Maliari presumably finished his primary and secondary education before heading off to the University of Santo Tomas to study theology. After graduating from the University of Santo Tomas, Maliari did not want to delay his path to priesthood and made sure he was ordained as soon as he graduated. His ordination took place in 1809, and right after that, Maliari became a so-called coadjutor of Gapang, Lubao, and Bacolor. He then decided to apply to become a pastor or a parish priest of Orani in Bataan, but he failed. He tried his luck for the same post in Mariveles, Bataan, but he also failed. He then applied for a similar post in Lubao, Pampanga, and failed once again. He therefore decided to apply to become a chaplain instead of the port of Cavite, but yet again he was rejected. Maliari's time to finally put his academics to good use at last came in 1812, when he was finally appointed parish priest of San Bartolome Parish in Magalang, Pampanga. Aside from being a theologist and a priest, of course, Maliari also dabbled in calligraphy, or calligraphic art to be exact. Maliari was one of only 2 priests at the time who were recognized and acknowledged as the first and second calligraphic artist priests. Calligraphic art, as a part of Filipino folk art, was used to usually decorate the edges of manuscripts. In Maliari's case, he used calligraphic art to decorate parish annual reports called Planes de Almas. Historical records show that Maliari's favorite subjects were flowery vines and naked boy angels perched on swirling clouds. He was said to be not only good at this particular skill, but also to be a genius when it came to art in general. And it was exactly this genius that apparently caused bouts of mental instability in Maliari. Historians who looked closely into Maliari do agree that he likely suffered from depression and perhaps another mental illness. What they also agree on is that Maliari was under a lot of stress around 1816, and one major stressor was his mother's illness, the nature of which was never really determined. Sources say it was a strange illness, and as time went on, Maliari concluded that her strange illness was the result of a curse, or what Filipinos would call kulam. It was also around this time that Maliari eventually ended up believing that the only way to cure her strange illness was to kill other people. Historians would theorize that this all made sense in Maliari's mind as a result of his declining mental health. A usual question asked when talking about Maliari's declining mental health is whether his colleagues and fellow priests noticed the change in him at all. It is certainly safe to assume that Maliari's demeanor would have changed, and he could have appeared erratic or, at the very least, very different from his usual self. So I can imagine that his colleagues would have noticed something, but did not necessarily think that this was an alarming change in him. From our perspective in 2021, of course, we now know that that kind of change in demeanor or some noticeable behavioral changes should have really alarmed his colleagues. Because it was around this time in 1816 that the first killings in Magalang took place. these were killings that baffled the police and the townspeople. The killings continued until 1826, and around 57 murder victims would be found in Magalang. The police could not figure out who was murdering the residents of Magalang and why no one had been able to witness anything. By 1826, Father Maliari fell ill. Some sources say that he fell into a deep psychosis, and some say that his illness was actually unknown. Nevertheless, he was not able to do his duties as a priest anymore. Instead, a priest came to him to look after him when he could not get out of his home. Now, this priest had noticed that there were certain objects in Maliari's home that looked very much like the things owned by the murder victims from the last 10 years. Now, you might ask, how was this priest so sure that these objects belonged to the murder victims? As it turned out, the 57 individuals who were murdered were actually parishioners in Magalang, and the priest who looked after Maliari was possibly of the same or nearby parish, and therefore familiar with the parishioners and the murder mystery of the last 10 years. In a small town like that, and at that point in history, it is possible that information about what the murder victims owned, or whether anything was missing from their possession at the time of their murders, was somewhat public knowledge. But of course, I am merely speculating. Historical records are not exactly clear how it all went down after this discovery by the other priests, but suffice it to say, a very ill Maliari was eventually dragged out of Pampanga and into a prison cell in Manila. Commenters on this case found it very odd that Maliari was not committed to a mental health institution or mental institution instead, since Spain was one of the first countries at that time that recognized the importance of treating mentally ill patients humanely. Spain, after all, built and established one of the first psychiatric hospitals in Europe called El Hospital de Inocentes, which believed and emphasized the innocence of the mentally ill who were not supposed to be held responsible for their actions, criminal or otherwise. A historian by the name of Dr. Santiago, who looked into Maliari's case as well, believed that he should never have been imprisoned. Instead, he should have been committed to the San Lazaro Hospital, the Philippines' first mental health institution. At that time, San Lazaro had been operating for 15 years already, so there was no reason not to commit Maliari there. Other historians theorize that perhaps the police authorities felt completely outraged by what happened in the last 10 years, seeing or hearing about the devastation left in the wake of Maliari's murder of 57 people from Magalang. And that's why they could not be bothered by being mindful of his mental health anymore. From the few historical records that we do have, it does seem like there was a trial, and the lawyer representing the Spanish crown or the state said that Maliari was essentially a monster. Maliari, on the other hand, recounted that his murders were justified because, as it turned out, he genuinely believed that killing his parishioners would cure his bewitched mother. In that so-called trial, it became clear that Maliari did not stand a chance. The Spanish authorities found him guilty and also looked at him as sort of an evidence for what they believed was an Indio's tendency to believe and tell ghost stories and other supernatural tales. And for those who are not well versed in Filipino colonial history, Indio was a derogatory name for Filipinos back in colonial times. As a result of the guilty verdict, Maliari was imprisoned for 14 years, presumably without any mental health or medical support. By 1840, it was somehow decided that he should be hanged. After he was executed, Father Maliari would since be known not only as the Philippines' first serial killer, but also the first Filipino priest executed by the colonial government. The next priests to be executed were the three clergymen collectively known as Gomburza, consisting of Father Gomez, Father Burgos, and Father Zamora, all falsely accused of treason in 1872. Admittedly, there are a lot of sad things about this story. Firstly, we do not know the identities of the 57 murdered parishioners because records of crime victims did not really exist like they do today. We also see a man who was deeply disturbed and never got the mental health support and treatment that he so badly needed. I think it is fair to wonder that if he had gotten treatment and support very early on, maybe the murders would never have taken place. However, I keep thinking about the fact that Maliari, despite his declining mental health, somehow still remained undetected. If it had not been for the visiting priest at his home, Maliari would either have continued killing or would have died and taken his secrets to his grave. Does his method show that he was cognizant of the wrongness of his actions, or did his madness inform his meticulous methods? Research into Maliari's life is interesting, and there is certainly much to learn and uncover still. I hope that in due time, historians will be able to reveal a little bit more about his life, the lives of his victims, and other missing parts of this rather heinous story. The story of Father Maliari has a rather sinister ring to it, given that he was a priest and should be the last person to be committing any sort of crime. But what is even more sinister is when one's crimes become urban legend, enduring over decades and feared by so many, because that is exactly what happened in our next story on Mualito, aka Waway, Toledo. The name Mualito, Waway, Toledo first came into anybody's consciousness in the late 1980s when Toledo was charged with reckless imprudence resulting in a homicide on the 8th of November 1989. And this is one of only a few exact dates that we have in this story. The timeline of Toledo's criminal activities is a bit all over the place, but I think a good place to start this story is with the widely accepted reason why Toledo turned out the way he turned out. According to one rumor, Toledo had to endure a very traumatic experience when his wife was apparently brutally raped and murdered by armed men right in front of him. According to the same rumors, something snapped in Toledo that day that made him somehow inflict the same pain he thought his wife endured. Other people would confidently object to that version of Toledo's, villain origin story. According to another version of that rumor, it was actually Toledo who brutally murdered his own wife, only to discover that he very much liked the rush he felt afterwards. In his attempt to get another hit, and then another hit of that rush, he started killing and raping for the next decade or so. After the charges were laid in 1989, as earlier mentioned, Toledo was also arrested in 1999 for a rape that he allegedly perpetrated 3 years earlier in 1996. It is not clear whether the rape victim was also eventually murdered, and it is also not clear whether after the 1989 arrest, Toledo was sentenced and then released, only to commit the rape in 1999. I reckon that the case in 1999 was just a rape case because what we do know was that this case was somehow settled out of court, a rather bizarre result since rape is not a civil matter that just can be settled out of court but a criminal one. I initially thought that maybe this meant that a plea deal was reached, but even then, I would like to think that a plea deal would include some jail time for a person who quite literally raped someone. Information about this 1999 rape case is rather scarce on the internet, so we are unfortunately left wondering what really happened there. Now, moving on to the 2000s, we do know that in September 2002, Waway Toledo was charged with rape yet again, but he managed to escape and stay off the grid for 5 whole years, only to be implicated in the rape and murder of a 17-year-old female student in Danao, Cebu. During my research, I noticed that yet again, there was not a lot of information about this particular case. So I naturally concluded that because it said implicated in the rape and murder of the student, maybe Toledo had gotten away with it again and was never actually caught by the police, let alone did he face trial. So, in short, this crime also went unpunished. Now, bear in mind, these are the cases that are recorded and can be verified by police records. But Waway Toledo is said to have raped and or murdered in different parts of Cebu, such as Lapu-Lapu, Consolacion, and Liloan, without these crimes coming under police's radar or being attributed to Toledo specifically. It is also rumored that Waway Toledo had killed at least 40 people in one day in a sort of frenzy kill, which also went, bizarrely enough, unpunished. Nevertheless, even those recorded cases alone were enough to prompt both the police and even the local government in Cebu to do a bit more than usual. Wanted posters were plastered all over Cebu, and the local government even offered a reward to anyone who could provide the police with information about Waway Toledo. But to this day, no one has been given that reward because Toledo is believed to be still on the run. And this really propelled him to urban legend and maybe boogeyman status. Cebuanos were and may still be in such fear of this man that rumors have popped up at various times in the last 30 years or so about how Toledo was able to elude the authorities all these years. Some have said that he has or had a talisman, or what we call in the Philippines an anting-anting, that helped him evade the authorities all these years. But the police in Danao, Cebu vehemently deny this rumor. Former Danao Police Chief Larson De Chino once stated that Toledo did not possess any anting-anting. It was also Chief De Chino who claimed that actually Toledo's wife was never murdered, therefore giving us the impression that Toledo truly just killed just for the heck of it. Another rumor that has been circulating about Toledo was that he is some sort of a shapeshifter, transforming himself into an animal in order to stalk his next victim. Legend has it that Toledo, in animal form, would spit on the shoes or slippers of his next victims. Some people in Cebu therefore started taking their footwear into their homes and also stopped walking outside after dark because they feared that they'd fall victim to Toledo. Chief De Chino did not care much for that story when asked about it, denying that Toledo has any supernatural powers at all. According to him, Toledo was just an ordinary fugitive who got lucky. If you ask me, I think there is a chance that Toledo could still be alive, but may have left his life of crime behind him already. After all, he should be in his 50s or late 60s even. His name has not resurfaced in connection to anything else, meaning that killings similar to those in 89, 99, and 2002 have probably stopped. However, it is also possible that killings have been taking place, but the police have not been able to connect the dots and view these killings as individual or isolated cases. If Toledo is making a point of killing in different jurisdictions, he knows that the police in those jurisdictions might not necessarily communicate with each other or compare notes. Yet another reason why serial killings are probably not recorded as much in the Philippines and why serial killers are not necessarily labeled as such. Nevertheless, it has been almost 20 years since the last killing or rape that was attributed to Toledo. And since we've not heard anything that can be compared to his past crimes, I can also imagine that he might have passed away already, or maybe he has changed locations. Either way, I think we should all remain vigilant. To round off this episode about Filipino serial killers, I just wanted to say that I have decided to exclude one other story about a possible serial killer from Negros, Oriental. I say possible because some records show that the witness in this case retracted their testimony, and in reality, the accused or the serial killer was innocent. The supposed serial killer is named Armando Sierra. He's part of a rather wealthy family in that part of Visayas. I have included a link in the sources list and also the show notes to a Wattpad entry that has a comment from someone who apparently knew Sierra quite well. It is a short but interesting read, so definitely worth your 10 minutes. But as always, take it with a grain of salt. With that being said, I hope you liked this rather short episode and slightly different content. I definitely enjoyed looking into these two people who still fascinate true crime fans in the Philippines. Lagim Podcast's next episode will be the anniversary episode to be released on the 4th of December. And like I said, that's a Saturday. The format and length will be the usual, so don't worry. As I said in another post on Instagram and in some of my stories on Instagram as well, I just needed a bit more time for the anniversary episode, so I decided to keep this current episode slightly shorter. Lagim fam, thank you so much for tuning into this express episode, and I do hope that you liked it. Make sure to give Lagim a rate and review on Apple and iTunes, and make sure to follow us on Spotify, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. All the links are in the show notes and in our Instagram bio. It will be such a lovely Christmas gift to me if you can help me get to 100 reviews on Apple or iTunes. I would be completely over the moon if this happened. Again, thank you so much for your support, and I shall see you again next week for our anniversary episode. Thank you, maraming salamat, at mabuhay.